We're listening in stereo. This is more wired than I've ever been, I think. Well, it's nice to be here. It's been a year or two since I've been to this meeting, and some faces familiar, and some of these guys I travel quite a lot. I see several from Department of Corrections, and so it's good to be here. What they'd asked me to do is talk a little bit about things that are happening in the news of veterinary medicine, and then some other herd health issues. And despite the fact that it's not pink eye time of the year, before I'm back, it will be. And so let's talk a little bit about pink eye in the end of what we do. And the technology may catch up with us here. Who knows? I, of course, read more veterinary news than all of you probably read. But I'll start by kind of telling you the things that I chose to talk about a little bit here today. Botulism. You say, botulism, I never heard of that. Well, it's because you haven't been in Southwest Virginia the last couple of months. We've been talking about it a fair bit there, and I hope you continue to be ignorant about that, but just in case you aren't, you kind of need to be prepared. In my career, there are a few real disasters, I mean, tens and tens of thousands of dollars worth of disasters in animal disease, and this has been one of them. You should be hearing a little bit about antibiotic use in cattle. And you can kind of stick your head in the sand and say, well, I hope things don't really change very much, but they're going to, I promise you. There is enough political will out there to change the way that we use antibiotics, everywhere. Your family practitioner doesn't dispense antibiotics for every sniffle and sneeze like he used to, so that's kind of changing everywhere. A new dewormer that you started hearing about last year, and I'll give you a little update on that, and thanks to our Department of Corrections folks who've helped us do some research there. And then if there's time, we'll talk about pink eye a little bit. There we go. So the day I was at this stalker operation in Southwest Virginia, and that was one of the calves you looked at, and one of these days I need to master a video, because what I tried to catch was that calf was having a hard time using his rear end. And in fact, a well-seasoned veterinarian looked at a couple of these when this issue first started and said, I believe those things hurt their back. They just aren't right behind. But we looked around a little more, and that's kind of a funny picture, but what that is that's a wad of hay with some grain in it that fell out on the ground there, and there was a great big old pool of saliva there, and I somehow couldn't catch one of them that was drooling that saliva, but these guys were having a hard time swallowing, and so they'd get this hay in their mouth and wallow it around for a while, and then they just wouldn't be able to get it down. Eventually it would drop out, and they weren't doing a good job of swallowing their saliva either. And then in a little while they went down. And that calf is actually pretty alert. He's not in the process of dying like a lot of the cattle that we see that are down. You can see where he's pawed the ground and moved his head around there some. And one of the things that was remarkable, I don't know how many of you have gone and tried to pull a tongue out of a calf's mouth or a cow's mouth. That old tongue's a pretty strong organ. And you don't just grab a hold of that and pull it out. But these calves, you'd pull it right out. Now, y'all think that calf's dead, but he was blinking. And an interesting thing is when I pulled that tongue out of his mouth, it stayed out. And you get a little more picture that calf, he's alert enough, I mean, he's not really sick. He's not dehydrated. But by golly, he can't do very much with that tongue. And if you look a little, you can see that there's one who's worked his way down, and then there's one laying down there, and there's one laying down there. And if you could kind of look all the way around that field, you'd see that there are 8 of those that are down. And all 8 of those died. We tried to treat them that day, but we weren't successful in treating any of those. So this started one day at this operation, and they had several pens of stalker cattle around. And by the next day, they and their veterinarian was very much involved, and they decided that one of the things, there were like 4 groups of cattle, and 2 of those groups were completely normal, and the other groups the other two groups had down cattle, and they kind of pinpointed and you know, I mean, just incredibly, that this baleage, that's triticale, that was actually harvested, what I just said was pretty well rolled up and put in these tubes, you know, that seals it off, so it insiles, so it's baleage. And they decided that that was the thing that was common, and they removed those bales. And that was on Sunday when they took those bales out. On Monday, the man called me. I've been associated, kind of known his operation for a long while. And I said, well, you know, if indeed it was something in those bales, why, your problem will be over by, you know, tomorrow, or, you know, pretty quickly. They've got those bales pulled out of there on Monday or on Sunday. Well, as it turns out, that was not true. I had not done my homework. Because for 10 more days they had more sick cattle, and cattle kept dying for more than 2 weeks after he had called me on the phone. So their veterinarian did a nice job of kind of putting the things together, and he said, I believe that what you have is botulism. Now, botulism is a bacteria that's related to the blackleg one, so it's Clostridium botulinum. But these bacteria produce a very potent toxin, poison or toxin. In fact, one of the most potent toxins that's known to man. Like the blackleg or the tetanus, which is another cousin, they grow in areas where there's little oxygen. And of course, those bales that are put in that sleeve, that's what they're trying to do, is to create an environment where there's no oxygen. And like tetanus and Clostridium and the other Clostridiums, they have spores that survive in the soil for years. So it may have been that this outbreak started 50 years ago when there was a pile of dead groundhogs or 2 or 3 dead cows, or you know, who knows what was dead there that put all those spores in the soil. Not only do cattle die of botulism, but many species of animals and birds and people. That lists chickens. I guess, you know, we've fed broiler litter quite a lot in this part of the world, and we always tell people, well, be sure you pull the dead birds out of that if we're going to feed that broiler litter. Well, I don't know if it was just bad luck, but they fed chicken litter to cattle in Australia and killed thousands of them, and that made it illegal to feed chicken litter in Australia because of that. Horses, of course, you know, if a horse gets sick, why, it's big business, and so a lot of the research has been done in areas where horses have had it, but wildlife and goats and sheep and even reptiles and fish affected with that. Let's see here. Okay. So for a long time it was believed that these bacteria only grew essentially in dead animals. That was kind of what they told me in veterinary school, and they said, if you've got cattle that have botulism, it's because they ate a dead something. You know, they ate a dead groundhog or a dead fawn that was baled up in the bale, or maybe rats got into your hay and they died and the cattle have eaten the rats. But now we understand that the bacteria can actually grow in food and feedstuffs, and that in some cases it can even grow inside animals if you've got a place where there's no oxygen, a wound, for example. So what this toxin does, what this poison does, is it paralyzes the muscles. And the clinical signs and the death are all related to that. So these poor cattle that are trying to swallow, the problem is that their throat muscles are paralyzed. And we talked about the tongue being paralyzed, and you know, those animals didn't have injured backs. It's just that the muscles that keep our backs up and make our rear legs work in these cattle were not functioning properly. And eventually they didn't have enough strength to stand up, and the ones that eventually die, it's because their breathing muscles eventually give up. In the beginning, these cattle looked like other sick cattle. You know, they were depressed with their ears and heads down, but they were different. And this producer he's almost, well, he's better than a lot of veterinarians in terms of finding a sick calf and knowing how to treat him. You know, he goes through hundreds of stocker cattle every year, so he's practiced at that a whole bunch. And he picked these animals out as being sick, but when he got them up and took their temperature was normal. He said, you know, these are not typical cattle with shipping fever, with pneumonia. So, you know, they still try to eat, as we mentioned, and that's not true of many of the sicknesses that cattle get. Well, as the disease goes along, this swallowing is kind of a diagnostic thing, and the ones that get a lot of the toxin died in hours, but some of them will be down for days before the respiratory system fails and they finally die. Finding the source of the bacteria and toxin is crucial. Any source that could contain dead animals should be highly suspected. Interestingly, as we started reading about botulism, they know quite a lot about it in Australia. I told you about the chicken litter outbreaks, but they tend to have pretty phosphorus deficient soils, and so these cattle are walking around looking for something, and they'll chew on bones and carcasses because of the phosphorus there, and they get the toxin out of there, and so a pretty common disease in Australia because of that. Now, as I said, you'd think that once you got the offending feed stuff out of there, then the death had soon ceased. In fact, animal deaths continue for up to 2 weeks or even 3 weeks after the feedstuffs have been removed. And whether these toxins are just really slow to get out of the stomach or rumen, whether the spores actually grow in the rumen, we don't totally understand. But you know, this producer really wished that what I'd said is that by tomorrow it'll be over was true, but it wasn't. You know, these cattle continued to be sick for a long time. Well, it's now obvious that botulism grows in ensiled forages under certain conditions, and it seems like these cereal halages or baleages are particularly at risk. No reports of it in corn silage ever. And, you know, corn is the ideal stuff to ensile, right? It's got lots of sugars and lots of starch in there, so when you put that in the silo, it gets really acid really quickly. The baleages that we make don't have nearly as much sugar and starch in there, and I'm going to talk a little more about that, but we probably aren't as good at making those as people who are corn silage makers tend to be. You know, lots of us have kind of come to this baleage making because oh my gosh, it rained a whole bunch last year and the year before, and we can put up hay even though it's going to rain tomorrow if we have a bag to put it in where we can have it ensiled. It's not clear why these cereal baleages are particularly at risk. Is there something different about those that's different than grass hays? Is the ensiling process different? You know, is the haylage that we're talking about often too wet or too dry? And I think this is an important question. Is there more soil contamination? One of the things that was different about this, and this guy had made this triticale baleage for a lot of years, is that he bought a new rake. And when I asked him about this rotary rake, he said, "Boy, it is the best piece of equipment I've ever bought. It does not leave a stick of that forage out in the field. It just picks it all up." And I asked, "Well, once in a while does a little dust fly up?" And he said, "Well, yeah, it's probably getting a little dirt in there." And we ran an ash content on that, and sure enough, there was a significant amount of dirt in there. And so, you know, if you've bought one of those new rakes, you know, maybe you want to raise that thing up a little bit because that's where we think those spores came from, was out of the dirt. Well, treatments for botulism have limited success. We tried activated charcoal and some of the absorptive clays like people put in their rations, particularly dairymen for mycotoxins. And you know, cattle that are not right down, maybe you know, putting fluids and some gruels that have some nutrition in them would be useful. There is an antitoxin. Just like there's an antitoxin for tetanus, there's one for this. That $150 a dose made our producer swallow pretty hard. But you know, eventually he said, well, these dang cattle are worth $1,000 or $1,100 a piece. And so he bought some, and in the end, they compromised a little bit, and they actually split doses. But they were convinced that in the end it helped, that these cattle really did get better. And they actually got a few cattle that were down up using this antitoxin. Vaccination is actually practiced pretty extensively in Australia, but the only vaccine that's available in this country is one for horses. And once again, they had to swallow pretty hard because we're used to paying $1 or $2 a dose for vaccines, and $11 for horse vaccine made them swallow pretty hard. But in the end, you saw that big old row of those triticale bales, and so they bought it, and you got to give 2 doses, so that's $22 a head. And he asked my advice about how I'm going to do that, and I said, well, I don't believe I'd turn all 35 of them that you vaccinated in there all at once. Maybe I'd pick out my least favorite 2 or 3 and turn those in and kind of see how things go. So those cattle are about to get their booster, and then it'll be a couple of weeks while they build immunity before we're willing to turn those cattle in there and see how we get along. Well, a number of outbreaks have occurred in cattle in the mid-Atlantic United States, and it's always been associated with cattle that are eating harvested feeds rather than grazing like they see in Australia. But it's been seen in dairy cows and beef cows and stocker and backgrounding settings. This outbreak in Southwest Virginia, as I told you, was triticale. Eventually we were able to take a test on those bales and find the presence of the toxin. It's a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack. As it turns out, we found that needle, but we're not recommending that you go home and analyze all your baleage to see if you can find it, because there's every possibility that you would not find it, but it might still be there. And in fact, these bales were pretty well made. They had pHs in the 4 to 5 range. What people are saying to us now is that we want that pH below 4.5, and we really want to do that quickly. We want this ensiling process to proceed very quickly. Are we ready to abandon making baleage? And I think the answer is no. Presently the incidence of botulism isn't high enough to justify that. But this kind of disastrous outbreak will give us pause to think, and it's kind of a reminder that I think the thing we get caught in sometimes is that we're kind of in the middle. We kind of say, well, I'd really like to make this as hay, but there's a storm coming tomorrow, and so I'm going to go ahead and roll it up and put it in a bag. Really, for the ensiling process to go well, things ought to be pretty liquid. I'm kind of hearing that, and I'm, once again, I'm walking in somebody's turf, but if we get much over 50% dry matter, then the ensiling process is not going to go very well. And we see analysis of some of these that are 60% dry matter, 70% dry matter even, that's almost hay, but not quite. And we wouldn't expect those to ensile very well. So, make your decision, and if you're going to make baleage out of it, do it before it gets so dried out that you're not going to have enough moisture to make this ensiling process move along pretty well. The other thing is that, watching cattle closely for disease is always a top-of-the-line herd health recommendation. And, if they're sick and there's not a fever, then you ought to act as quickly as you can because it'll increase the odds that you save others. Interestingly enough, we brought some of these cattle to the vet clinic at the vet school, and at the same time we had some cows that came from West Virginia. This one, the stalker, when they put 35 head in the hole, the guy who had the cows put 49 cows in the hole before it was all over. So those are real horror stories, and we don't want to be kind of in that. A question here?
A comment. I recall many, many years ago when Fort Detrick was in the midst of biological and chemical warfare. I remember reading some place, and don't ask me where or how, but so my question to you, have you talked to anyone around Fort Detrick who may have been involved when biological chemical warfare was a big thing?
He's asking about biological and chemical warfare, and by golly, botulism is one of the things they talk about when they do biological warfare because the toxin is so very, very potent. You remember the white powders and the anthrax business? Of course, that has been used a little bit in biological warfare, and anthrax, once again, is an organism that makes a spore like this botulism does, and yeah, that's something to think about a little bit. Let me say one other thing. We had a meeting in Wytheville, in the area where this happened, and one of the things that kind of came out of that meeting was that this man from West Virginia that had lost all these cattle was there, and he said, this land where I made, his was rilage instead of triticale baleage, it had been really, really wet, and it had kind of been flooded, and that kind of made a little light go off in my head. There are parts of the country that will have outbreaks of anthrax in cattle. I mean, kill hundreds of them. And it tends to be in dry states, states that only get 15 inches of rain a year, in the grazing season after they've had a flood. And the idea is that these spores are kind of buried up places where cattle died 50 years ago, and we get this flood, and it washes out those spores, and then they get on the pastures, and then the cattle die of anthrax because of that. So maybe our really wet spring and summer last year had something to do with seeing more of those cases. Okay, let's go from there to talking a little bit about the antibiotic changes. If you've been paying attention, if you read any farm press at all, you've probably read some about that. And I, like I say, changes are coming in the way that antibiotics are used in food animals. My guess is this is just, the first volley in what I think is going to kind of change the way we have to do things. In December, the FDA published a guidance for the industry that starts the clock running on some of these changes. Initially, the big changes are going to be in animal health companies. So people read a little bit and they call me up or they write me an email and say, what's going to be different for me, Doc? And those adjustments will eventually make their way down to people who prescribe and use the drugs, veterinarians and livestock producers. Really right now, it's the animal health companies that produce these products that are a little bit under the gun. And the basis for why this discussion is taking place is the idea of resistant bacterial infections in humans. Antibiotics have really been wonderful. They've saved thousands and thousands of lives. They've improved the quality of all of our lives, because everybody here probably has had an infection where they've taken an antibiotic, and they really have been miraculous. And what many people are concerned about is that if we overuse those, and I should say there's certainly no debate that antibiotics that once worked very well, after a while don't work as well. And they don't work as well because when we use those antibiotics, we kill most of the bacteria, but there are a few tough ones there that survive, and those go on to be the next generation of the bacteria. So over years, the average population of bacteria out there gets tougher. And of course, places where that really becomes an issue are human hospitals, where they use lots of antibiotics. And they create some superbugs there that you can't kill with a sledgehammer. I mean, they are really tough, and it's a risk when you go to one of those hospitals of getting one of these superbugs. Well, producers associations, cattlemen's associations have seen the writing on the wall for a couple of years now. But what do these changes really mean for livestock producers? What will change? Well, what these legislation that's passed talks about what are called medically important antibiotics. And basically that means things that are important in treating human disease. And the thing that they've picked out is antibiotics for growth, promotion, and improvement. And so, we've backed away from these some in the cattle industry. Mostly they've been used at the feedlot level, but they're not going to let us do that anymore. And for a long while, we've not been able to, veterinarians have the ability to prescribe things in what they call an extra label fashion, and we will never again be able to do that, to say, okay, we want to put a little tetracycline in this feed or in whatever to help these cattle grow better. That's gone. That's kind of change. Now, what exactly does that translate to? Well, aureomycin crumbles. Anybody ever use aureomycin crumbles? I prescribe some aureomycin crumbles. And they've been pretty useful in a number of situations. But just being able to go to southern states and pick those up, the days of that are limited. And what you're going to have is, instead of calling it a prescription, they're calling it a veterinary feed directive. So we're going to have to learn that new VFD, a veterinary feed directive. And you're going to have to go to your veterinarian to get that. And that'll specify the farm and the animals to be treated and how long you're supposed to treat them and which drug we're supposed to use. And that'll have to either go to southern states or your feed mill if he's mixing up tetracycline. We'll hit, and they'll have to have one of those before they'll be in a position to supply that feed to you. And that veterinary feed directive can't just come from any veterinarian. We kind of got used to that. There was a day when you could call up a drug house in Omaha and there'd be some alcoholic veterinarian that would sit there and take your order and he'd write your prescription, right? I'm just being honest about the deal, right? Okay? So what the government says there's going to have to be is what they call a valid veterinary client-patient relationship. And that's been true for the prescription drugs that you get. It stops short of saying that as a veterinarian he needs to be there and see every sick cow and write a prescription for every sick cow. But basically it says that if a veterinarian is going to, for example, supply you with Draxxin or with Nuflor, he needs to be familiar with the caring and keeping of the animals on your farm, needs to be there periodically and know that you're going to use those responsibly. And those same rules are going to apply to this antibiotics that go in feeds. What won't change is that we'll, for the time being, be able to use these feed-grade antibiotics to treat, control, or prevent bacterial diseases. Occasionally I have work with an outbreak of anaplasmosis, and sometimes we decide to put high levels of tetracycline in the feed to treat those, and we'll be able to do that. This prevention is something that's being looked at pretty closely. A couple of years ago, there was a lot of discussion about the class of drugs that are called ceftiofur, and you'll know them as Naxel, Xanel, and Exceed. And I remember going to a meeting, and my friend Mike Goldwasser made a beeline for me. And Mike Goldwasser is a guy who makes his living buying 300-pound calves. And he can make his living doing that because he can keep the dang things alive. If any of you have ever tried that, it's harder than it looks. Because I'll tell you what, those little calves, they get sick and the light will just go out that quickly. And he said, the first years I did that, I walked through those calves 5 times a day to find the sick ones. And he, a master, he could figure out that calf was sick before the calf knew he was sick sometimes. But then he discovered this Exceed. And so every calf he buys, he gives him a shot of this Exceed. And he said, I'm not going back to walking them 5 times a day. If they take Exceed away from me, in a preventive fashion, I just won't be able to do this. I'll have to work with 6 weights or something, And as it turns out, they allow us to use these in a preventive fashion. Very high risk of illness if you don't administer the antibiotic, but the veterinarian's going to need to be involved in prescribing that. Some of the other things that we use that are non-medically important, ionophores, Rumensin, Bovatec, the coccidiosis medications, we're still going to be able to use those. Nobody's threatening them. Because those aren't things that are used very often, if at all, in human medicine, and so there are not going to be any changes in their use. Use of injectable antibiotics, for right now, nobody's threatened those. How many of you think 5 years from now we're still going to be able to buy tetracycline and penicillin at Southern States or Tractor Supply? 10 years? 20 years? Sometimes people get mad at veterinarians because they say, well, veterinarians are taking over the thing, got to see the veterinarian to get Nuflor, got to see him to do Draxxin and all that sort of stuff. I'm here to tell you, it's not the veterinarians out there that are pushing it. It's people who work for places like the CDC and the Food and Drug Administration that are pushing this. But, for right now, you can buy those, although Some of the over-the-counter things like some of the powder things, the water-soluble things, are going to be harder to get. In the end, let me just say a word about this. I didn't put it in there because I didn't want it to be of record, but I guess Chris is recording me, so I won't be able to deny that I said this. One of the questions that you all ought to have in your mind is, what about our tetracycline minerals, right? I'm seeing some nods of the head. Those have been, we think, pretty useful to us. Some of those of you that are in this room live in an area where anaplasmosis is a threat. Everybody lives in an area where pink eye is periodically a threat. And so we make up these antibiotics that are medicated antibiotics, and they have chlortetracycline in them. And the question I have in my mind is, am I going to be able to, first of all, are you going to be able to just continue to buy those? Some of you belong to organizations like the Amelia Cattlemen's Association that has minerals mixed up. Are we just going to be able to continue to do those? And that's a bit of a gray area, and we're not really sure right now where that's going to come down. I would guess that probably a veterinarian is going to have to write one of these VSE, veterinary feed directives, to have a mineral mix that contains tetracycline in it. I think we're going to be able to convince the powers that be that it truly is a preventive action in preventing anaplasmosis and in preventing pink eye when we do that, but that one's just a little bit in limbo. We're not sure exactly where that's going to fall. That's not going to fall this year, you know. I mean, you can still buy those medicated minerals. You'll be able to get them mixed. But as this moves along the track in 2 or 3 years, it could be that it gets more difficult to get those products that we're used to using.
So that VFD then has it. You know, some of the guys that buy this aren't associated with a given veterinarian, so
they will be if they want to buy it. Yeah. Yeah, and like I say, you know, people say, well, it's dang veterinarians. It's not us, you know. And in fact, we see it as something that'll make our life a little more complicated that probably we're not going to get paid for, you know. But yeah, I think that you know, not this summer and maybe not next summer, but you know, maybe after that, you're going to have one of these VFDs in order to buy aureomycin crumbles and in order to buy tetracycline medicated mineral. I think that's coming.
We, for example, would have to have a file of those forms signed off by
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. And I think there will be some of the places we're used to buying those things that'll just say, oh my, that's so much hassle, I'm just not going to carry those things anymore. I mean, that's what tends to happen. If there's more hassle, there will be, you know, a little feed store that's always handled those things that just say, I'm just not going to do that. You know, you're going to have to get them someplace else. And that means that we may have to travel a little further and, you know, work a little bit more with those that are willing to do that in order to get those medicated minerals, for example. Okay, any other questions or comments about that? I hope that answers questions rather than confuses you about it, but you know, we're still looking for answers, but they're pretty serious about this. This deal is gonna change some. All right, let's talk about a new dewormer. This new dewormer is called Longrange, and if you didn't hear about that, you didn't go to very many cattle meetings last year because they were out there pedaling that full speed ahead. And it's an injectable dewormer. And it has as its active product eprinamectin, which is the ivermectin family, as you'd guess. Immediately, if you bought some, you recognize that it wasn't like the others because it cost a whole bunch more. You know, we've gotten used to these ivermectin things being really cheap. And this one, you know, we were talking about a little more than $1 a cc for that stuff, and you had to use a cc for every 100 pounds. So if you were treating you know, 600 or 700 pound steer, why that added up pretty quickly. And the company said you ought to be doing that to cows too. And I swallow really hard when I look at a 1,400 pound cow and say, I'm really going to put $15 worth of dewormer into that cow. The product works by forming a gel under the skin when you inject it. It's really important that it be injected under the skin rather than in the muscle. And then the active product is absorbed out of that gel and has a label claim for 100 plus days of protection for Ostratagia, which we have thought is one of our really important worms, 120 days against new parasite infections. Well, what I'm going to show you is some data from the Department of Corrections, and some of you are close enough you'll be able to read, but I just want you to see that these lines kind of go up and down. I will tell you that DIN stands for Dinwiddie, and that isn't very far from here, and that you can see that those calves at Dinwiddie were shedding a whole lot of eggs when we sampled them the middle of June, or the end of June, 1st of July last year. You know, there were places that were not nearly as infected. Here's Greenville, that's over in Augusta County, and those cattle didn't have as much infection. But there was quite a lot of variation as we sampled these cattle, and we actually worked on cattle that were in 22 different pastures. Sometimes there were several pastures on a farm. For example, James River up here north of us had cattle in 7 different pastures that we used in this study. And so we treated them with 2 different products. We either treated them with a poron ivermectin product, or we treated them with this Longrange. And what this graph does is at some of those locations, we came back in 2 weeks and took fecal samples again to see, what were we getting done. And the percentage is the percentage of reduction that we saw. What about this one that goes along the line? It means it actually increased. So we poured on this ivermectin, and we came back in 2 weeks, and we actually had 165% improvement or increase in the number of eggs that were being shed in the feces. Now, it was rainy, and we tried hard to kind of not treat this in the middle of a rainstorm, but it could well be that all of that generic ivermectin washed off, and that's the reason that one didn't work. We're a little unsure as to whether that was the case or whether there is actually resistance to that product that made it not work. All of these lines over here, LR means long range, so all of those were treated with long range, and you can see that we got from an 85% decrease in the number of eggs that were being shed up to a 98% improvement in the number of eggs that shed. So sure enough, at this point, it looks like, hey, this long range is doing pretty good. We paid high money for it. Looks like it's given us, more of an improvement. Well, really, what we were interested though is, did we gain more weights? And so we actually sampled these calves. Let's see, I must have gone. Well, I've got a slide ahead. We weighed these spring-born calves in late June or early July, and that's when we treated them. And 2/3 of the calves we treated with the poron ivermectin, and only 1/3 of them did we treat with the long range. What we were trying to do is avoid that the long range calves would graze up all the worms on the pastures and protect the others. So that's why we did the 1/3, 2/3 deal instead of doing half and half. And we weighed those calves again at preg check, which was kind of in August, and then they were weaned about the 1st of October, and that's when we weighed them. And the weaning was about 100 days after treatment. So we should have been in the realm of when we would have expected that long range to still be working. In fact, we collected fecal samples, and sure enough it was. Well, the average calf gained 256 pounds during that time from the 1st of July essentially to the 1st of August. That was about 2 pounds a day, and that's kind of what we'd hope calves out there would be gaining. But I was frankly a little disappointed in the difference between the gains. The long range calves, the good news is they gain faster, but they gain 6.5 extra pounds more. And when you talk to people that are selling this, they'll talk to you about 30 and 40 and 50 and 100 extra pounds. Well, when we did 900 calves and we treated them in different ways, we only ended up with a 6.5 pound advantage. And the long range treated calves in 12 of the 22 pastures gained more than the poron calves, but in 10 of those pastures, actually the poron treated ones gained a little more. So, if indeed you get that 6.5 extra pounds, that doesn't seem like very much. But calf gain is quite a lot. It's worth quite a lot now. Those calves weighed about 400 pounds, so it cost us $4 or so to treat it. Is 6.5 pounds worth $4? Well, yeah, it is today. Sure enough, it is. And so it probably makes economic sense, but it's not sterling in terms of the difference. And it may be that, you know, your calves' pasture is going to be one of those where the pour-on got you a little more gain than did the Longrange. Questions or comments about that? Where are we time-wise? Okay, we got a few minutes to talk about. Yeah, Taylor.
Don't you have to have a prescription for the Longrange also?
You do. Yep, it is a veterinary labeled product, so you're going to have to work with a veterinarian to secure that. Just by the way, probably every new product that appears these days is going to have a veterinary prescription label on. And like I say, that's not because veterinarians are out there lobbying for that. It's just the order of the day. So, yeah, Mr. Rayford.
Back to the other doctor's speech. The question was asked, do these worms kill dung beetles?
The pour-on Ivomec does. There is one of this family of kind of the ivermectin family that's called Cydectin, and it does not kill dung beetles. And that company that makes that product has advertised that pretty widely. Epironamectin, when it's poured on, does. Whether there's enough of it in the manure of this product that comes out very slowly or not, I don't think I know. Did you talk about that, Chris?
I talked about dung beetles, yeah.
Okay.
I have no idea, though.
Yeah. As far as I know, there's no data about this Longrange and whether it would have an influence or not. The Altacid that we put in the salt and minerals does not affect dung beetles. So, yes, sir.
Is it a good idea to rotate on these pour-on the worms? Don't use the same one consecutively?
What we think is that the whole if these worms get resistance, they get resistant to the whole family. So if they were resistant to ivermectin, they'd be resistant to epironamectin, and they'd be resistant to Cydectin, and that whole family. Now there are other families of compounds out there. There's a family of products that we call the white dewormers, and so Safeguard is one of those that you see, but there are also some other products out there. And there are people saying, yeah, that's what we ought to do, is we ought to do that. Well, those white dewormers, you got to drench those things, and oh my gosh, it is nice to just pour that stuff on, isn't it, And so, certainly the people that are selling those white dewormers say, you bet you ought to rotate, you ought to use those periodically to prevent the resistance. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I guess I don't feel real strongly that we ought to be doing that. Okay, let's talk about pink eye for just a minute as I kind of finish up my deal. Chris, lunch is served at 12:30. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. The last thing I'd want to do is come between you and your lunch. That would be a dangerous thing to do. Well, people ask me to talk about pink eye, and I end up talking about it in the fall because they become aware that it's a problem in July and August, and then we get around to talking about it in October, and boy, it's a long time till pink eye season. So I thought I'd get a little jump on you because despite the fact that it's been really cold, and despite the fact that we had a lot of snow, hope springs eternal. There will be spring out there. And, we'll be back to grazing cattle, and we'll be back to dealing with this pink eye business. One of the humbling diseases in my whole career. I've thought a lot about it, worked a lot about it, treated a lot of it, and pink eye will be with us. Just a little bit of new data. For a long while, my pink eye talks had the data that was collected in the 70s and 80s. Here's a 2011 paper For a long while I've said, well, you know, calf that gets a case of pink eye, it's going to cost you about 10% of the weight gain. And what you see is that these are studies done in 2009 and 2010. And there's the number we want to look at right there. And that's in kilograms. And that's 10.4 kilograms. So that's about 25 pounds. And so sure enough, when we do the study again, we still certainly are losing pounds as a result of doing that. I'm going to get around to showing you this eye injection, but the picture that I have that catches this guy in the act is right there, so we're going to talk about him a little bit. So you can ignore that terrible needle pointing at that eye for just a minute. That's a face fly. And I have decided that the way we ought to work on preventing pink eye is on dealing with that face fly. And that face fly is different than the flies that you see up on the back and shoulders of cattle. Those are horn flies, and they're doing their own damage. They're bloodsuckers, but we're not going to talk about them. But this guy eats the secretions that are around the nose and under the eyes. And then if you watch these cattle out there in May, you know, they're kind of huddled up and it's mid-morning. By the way, those face flies don't spend all day on the cattle like the horn flies do. The horn flies, even if you go out there on a hot day and can't see them, they're underneath the belly. They don't leave the animal. That's where they stay. But these face flies, when it gets hot in the middle of the day and at night, they go to roost. They go out in the woods and are out in the trees. So kind of mid-morning and mid-afternoon or late afternoon is the time that you're going to see them. And what this guy's done is that he's crawled up on that eyelid, and he's got a mouth part that's about the shape of my hand, the palm of my hand, but it's like a rasp on the bottom. If you magnify it, it looks like a rasp. And he reaches up with that, and he scrapes some of those cells off the surface of that cornea for dessert. And that's a really bad thing. For one thing, his hygiene's not very good. He didn't wash his feet before he walked up there to do that. If there's somebody in the herd that has a case of pink eye, he's probably been there because there's lots of secretions there. He likes that. And then he comes over and gets on that one's eye, and when he gets on that one's eye, he both damages that cornea to let the bug in, and he also brings with him all the bugs that are going to create that case of pink eye. This is an early case of pink eye, and I'm just going to show you some pictures so you kind of understand the progression of the disease. You know, if you looked at that calf out in the field, you'd say, well, he's got a bit of a runny eye. But unless you got really close, you wouldn't notice that there's a little spot there that's cloudy. And the reason that's cloudy is because there's a little hole in that cornea. The cornea is the clear part of the eye, and if you think about that cornea, it's a very delicate structure, and it's also problematic because it doesn't have blood vessels running through it. You know, I've thought it's a little bit like, you know, in the old Indian days building a cabin, you kind of want to make a window because it's nice to have the light come in and be able to see out. However, that window's kind of at risk because you can shoot arrows through that thing, right? And it's kind of like that eye. It really needs to be, you know, pretty clear and pretty fragile because it lets the light in. However, you can shoot arrows through that thing, right? Because there is not any blood going through there. Therefore, the antibodies and the cells that fight disease are really lacking there. And then we just happen to have this bad disease called pink eye, and that cornea doesn't have much in the way of ammunition to fight against that. And so there's a little hole in there, and when you get that hole, then the fluids leak in there and distort the fibers in there, and it starts to get a little bit cloudy. That is a wonderful time to treat that case. Most of us don't. You know, we say, well, it's a little bit wet, but maybe it'll be better tomorrow, and so, you know, we put off treating that for a few days. But if you treat them then, they get better. I mean, they just get better really quickly. There isn't much damage to heal up, and they respond really well. This one's gone on for a week or 10 days. And that ulcer, which is like a sore, think about it like a big scab kind of place, has gotten really big. You know, you can see that, I mean, it goes down there, it's that big. And this eye is smart enough to know that the tears that usually are protecting that are not going to get the job done, and so what's it doing? It's marching blood vessels in. And can you see all those blood vessels that are growing in from, we call this the limbus. It's the junction between the white of the eye and the cornea, and those blood vessels are growing in trying to save that eye. This one's further along still. You can't see those blood vessels anymore because we've got a lot of edema and stuff in there, and that's where the word pink eye comes from. Eventually, it makes a scab in the middle of that, and you probably know that that scab is going to mean that there's going to be a scar there. There's a little bit of black there. Anybody know what that black is? That's the iris. The iris is your part of your eye that gives, in people, color. So if you have blue eyes, it's because you have a blue iris. If you have brown eyes, because you have a brown iris. If you have green eyes, you have a green iris. Well, in cattle, it's always black, and it's a little more sophisticated than ours. Ours is just, kind of a flat sheet. It actually has kind of a little hood there, and the pink eye process went all the way through this cornea, and that eye was going to pop, but that iris got in there and plugged the hole. And I've seen these where cattle get to see again. Only a cow, right? Try that with a horse or a dog, blind, I guarantee you. Try that with a person, blind, although they do fancy surgery and stuff, so it doesn't very often happen. But some of these will get so that they can see a little bit out of there. And then as the healing process goes on, that scar kind of shrinks down. You can see there's still a little bit of blood vessel there. And then eventually we end up with this scar. We've worked with our graders to have them understand that this calf does not have pink eye. He had pink eye at one point, but I got this special angle so you can see that light shining over the surface. This one's healed up, but that scar is going to be there. Now, it's not such a bad thing, right? I mean, this calf would have a hard time reading the newspaper, but then he doesn't have to read the newspaper, right? And so, that's the way he's going to be. Let's see. Whoops, I thought I had another picture there, but I guess I don't. Well, at any rate, sometimes we have other kind of complications, and this one is the pop eye. And what happened with this one is that there was so much inflammation in that eye that the fluids that are being produced inside drain through this place that's called the filtration angle, and it gets clogged up, and so the fluids can't get out, and so it gets glaucoma. And glaucoma is a buildup of pressure in the eye, and there's so much pressure that it causes that cornea to bulge out, and this eye is gone. We're not going to see out of this eye ever. In the old days, I used to do surgery and take out the whole eye. Now I figured out that if I just slash that eye with a scalpel, let everything leak out, that eye will kind of shrink down. And if I hurry that calf through that grading pen just fast enough, sometimes I can get him through there without him noticing that he doesn't have an eye, because he's still got the eyelashes and all that sort of stuff. And I might get that done. But he looks a lot better than the old ones that I used to take the eyes out of. Well, what do we treat with? We treat with tetracycline. Here's a product that has a big claim because it's 300 milligram. There's another one of those on the market. Do these antibiotics work? Yeah. Do they perform miracles? Well, they don't take that really big old, gone on for 2 weeks eye and have it look normal tomorrow. This is the stuff from, besides tetracycline, Draxxin has a label claim. And what they did here is they took calves and they put vinegar in their eyes, and then they put the Moraxella in there. So they created cases of pink eye. And then they started treating them. And some of them they just treated with salt water, and the others they gave this tulathromycin or Draxxin. And you can see that, in a few days, why some of them had cured up, and as the time went on, they got cured up, and by 17 days, we had them all cured up. The ones that just got treated with the salt water, even at 21 days, we've still got 60% of those that still have active pink eye lesions. So it hurries it up. And I really believe we ought to treat it, but don't expect a miracle. You go out to the one that you've ignored for 10 days, you give them a shot of, I don't care what you give them, they're not going to be better tomorrow. It takes time for this healing to take place. Let me just kind of finish off by showing you about this eye injection. The eye injection, let me tell you that there have been more of these given wrong than given right. Heaven forbid even veterinarians give them wrong. On occasion. None of the ones that got educated at Virginia Tech. We got them trained. But what we're going to do is we're going to put penicillin and maybe with a little bit of dexamethasone, a steroid in there, and we're going to inject it under the layer that's covering the white of that eye. Scary thing to do. Have somebody help you learn how to do it, because you can sure mess things up if you don't do it right. And I promise you that there's a layer covering the white of that eye, and what we're going to do is we're going to slide that needle under there. You've already seen that picture. But what I've done is I've gotten that under there, and I've lifted that layer up there so you can see that there's a layer there. And that's where we want to give that injection. And then we inject that penicillin, and it bulges up under there. And eventually we inject enough that it begins to leak out a little bit. That's good. That's going to leak over there for 2 or 3 days and treat that case of pink eye. Well, let me just say that sometimes we have a herd outbreak. And I describe it, a herd outbreak is greater than 10% of the herd affected. What are the things we're going to do if we've really got an outbreak? Well, I think that tall grass is really part of this picture. And so if, I've heard Brian Campbell give the talk, and he asked you to confess. Did your neighbors have, pastures that the grass got that high in last? But, nobody would admit theirs own did, but they all had some neighbors that did. That's really bad for this pink eye, because those tall grasses, they got a lot of pollen, and that irritates eyes, and the grass themselves bounce in there. So we need to get them to a pasture where that's not true. We need to get rid of those flies, because those flies are irritating, and they're spreading the disease. And I like to treat the whole herd. And I know I've cautioned you about the overuse of antibiotics, but I think this is a place where it's really justified. I think the long-duration tetracycline, LA300, LA200, whichever you're going to use, probably not the cows if it's a cow-calf herd, although there's some outbreaks where the cows get the disease as well. But this is a pretty economical drug, and it lasts for 2 or 3 days, and it'll just stop one of these outbreaks in its track. And if you don't treat everybody, you just treat the 5 that have it, then in 2 or 3 days you got 2 or 3 more, and in 2 or 3 days you got 2 or 3 more. And I really believe it's kind of worth biting the bullet and treating them all. How do we prevent it? Well, phase fly control, pasture management. What about the vaccines? Well, there are a lot of those vaccines out there. There's even one that's like an implant, so you can implant it at the base of the ear or in the neck. So there are a bunch of those out there. The thing that claims is that you can just give 1 dose. These other products, by and large, require you to come back and give a booster. The question is, do these products work? This is an amazingly honest vaccine advertisement. That company is no longer in business, so I can use their deal. But at the top they say field trials confirm efficacy. And it looks to me like if you're in Missouri or Iowa, you were delighted because, 100%, that means none of them got it. But if you're in Nebraska, you were madder than heck. What does 48% efficacy mean? It means 52% of your calves got pink eye. Were you pretty happy with that vaccine at the end of that deal? Not too. And, lots and lots of work been done on these vaccines, and they just don't work. I really think that you just ought not to spend your money on those. And everybody says, well, I'll tell you what, they probably don't work because we got the wrong strain. And so there's a company out there that says, I'll come culture the eyes and I'll make you an autogenous vaccine. And here's the study that was done. Let's see, that's this study right here that was done. Looking at that, Iowa State have a terrible pink eye problem every year. They're trying to select cattle that are resistant to the pink eye so they don't treat them very aggressively. And so in 2009 and 2010, they tried the autogenous one. And, you can kind of see, even with the vaccine, 23 out of 91 got it. In 2010, 35 out of 94 got it. In the end, if you're a statistician, they said there just wasn't any difference. Even that autogenous vaccine didn't solve the problem. So my conclusions are that pink eye will be with us for the foreseeable future. How do you reduce the risk? Phase fly control, pasture management, and then early treatment, I think, is the big thing that we're going to do. And with that, I think it's lunchtime. I'd be happy to answer a question if somebody has one.
If you back ran some cans, 60 to 90 days in August, September, would you benefit anything, or maybe actually put a little on that chromo tetracycline in the feed with them every 2 or 3 weeks? Or what do you think?
I think that very often the tetracycline in the feed helps the pink eye deal. In my experience, it doesn't totally prevent it, but I think it does. And as I said in my prior talk, I hope they'll let us continue to do that, to use that product.
Dee,
Okay,
Can I ask one question?
sure.
Is there, you showed the injection into the eyelid, which makes me squirm.
Into the conjunctiva, not the eyelid, right? If you're sticking it down through the eyelid, or if you're peeling that eyelid up and sticking it under there, just go back and give it in the tail. It'll do just as much good, right? It must go under that bulbar conjunctiva in order to work.
Okay. So, in essentially what that does is just a slow release of that.
It does, but it also, as the tears come through those, the tears absorb quite a lot of that as well.
Is there any benefit of doing like a drench just into the eye?
You know, there have been lots of those things that have been done. You know, if a horse gets an ulcer like that, they come into our clinic, and some clinician blithely writes an order and say, put ointment in his eye every 2 hours. Well, I was that student once, and I'm telling you, by 6 o'clock next morning, that horse doesn't want to see you, you know. And, well, I mean, kick you out of the stall, right? And you know, those things only last in the eye for a few minutes, really. And so if they're really going to do good, you got to treat them several times a day, and we just don't do that with cattle. You know, those studies have been done, and they work if you'll do that consistently. Let me just also say, don't put irritating stuff in there. I hope none of you have ever put salt in an eye trying to help a case of pink eye. That was favorite treatment in Southwest Virginia when I got there, and I hope we've got that stomped out. Can you imagine having a wound and somebody coming and rubbing a bunch of salt into it? Well, the eye's got to even hurt more than that. Don't do that, you know.
Is there any other questions? All right, let's thank Dee for his presentation. So I guess